The gym didn't have a sign. It sat behind a strip mall in Inglewood, California, and the only way you knew it was a gym at all was the steel door on the side that was always propped open with a cinder block when someone was inside. 1969, late afternoon, the kind of afternoon where the smog sits so low over Los Angeles that the sunlight turns the color of a bruise and everything feels heavy and still and waiting. Bruce Lee was inside alone. He had arrived 40 minutes early. That was not unusual. He was always early. Not because he was anxious, not because he was eager, because he liked to feel a room before it filled with people. He liked to understand the dimensions, the floor surface, the temperature, the way sound traveled from one corner to another. He stood in the center of the space, and he listened to the building breathe, and when he was satisfied that he understood the geometry of the place, he sat down on the wooden floor and closed his eyes. He was wearing a plain black shirt, dark pants, no shoes, no tape on his hands, no gloves, no mouthguard sitting on a bench somewhere. Nothing that suggested he was here to do anything at all except sit on a floor in a room that smelled like old leather and dried sweat, and the faint chemical trace of rubbing alcohol that had soaked into the wood over years. His forearms were resting on his knees. They were the only part of his body that hinted at what lived inside the rest of him. The tendons were visible, not in the way a lean man's tendons are visible, in the way that bridge cables are visible. They ran from his wrists to his elbows, like the strings on an instrument that had been tuned too tight and never loosened. His fingers were relaxed. His breathing was slow. He looked like a man who could sit in that position for an hour without moving and feel nothing about it except patience. He was 30 years old. He weighed 135 pounds. In a room full of heavy bags and iron chains, and a ring built for men twice his size, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. He looked like a student who had come on the wrong night. He looked like a man you would walk past on the street without a second thought, if you didn't know any better. But the floor under him knew. The air in the room knew. Something about the way he occupied space was different from the way other men occupied space. He didn't fill the room, he sharpened it. The gym was unfocused before he walked in, just a box of concrete and rubber and iron. After he sat down, it became specific. It became a place where something was going to happen. The mutual friend who had arranged this meeting had told him two things. First, that two brothers were coming. Second, that they were very good. He did not ask what kind of good. He did not ask for names or records or weight classes. He said one word on the phone before hanging up. Thursday, and now it was Thursday, and he was sitting on the floor, and the side door was propped open with a cinder block. And outside, in the parking lot that smelled like diesel and wet asphalt, a truck was pulling in. He heard it before it stopped, the engine cutting out, two doors opening, two doors closing, not at the same time, one and then the other. He heard gravel under boots, two sets of footsteps, and the footsteps were different. One pair was light and deliberate. The steps landed evenly, ball of the foot first, the walk of a man who had been taught to move with precision. The other pair was heavier, not clumsy, but dense. The footsteps of a man who carried his weight low and let the ground feel it. Bruce Lee did not open his eyes. He listened to them approach the door. He listened to one of them pause at the threshold and the other one step through without hesitating. He heard breathing. One man breathing through his nose, measured and controlled. The other breathing through his mouth, slightly faster. The breath of a man whose body was always running warmer than the room required. He let them stand there for 4 seconds, then 5. Then 6. Then he opened his eyes. The two men were standing 12 feet from him. They were looking at him the way men in gyms always looked at him, with a specific kind of calculation that happened behind the eyes before the face decided what expression to wear. They were measuring him, his height against theirs, his frame against theirs, his weight against the feeling of their own weight inside their own bodies. And the math they were doing behind their eyes was producing the same answer it always produced when men looked at Bruce Lee for the first time. He could see the answer settle into their shoulders, the almost imperceptible relaxation that happens when a man decides he is not in danger. The first one was tall, 6'2", maybe 220 pounds. He had shoulders that looked like they had been built by years of something specific, something repetitive, something that required precision and violence in equal measure. His hands were wrapped in white tape, not fresh tape, tape that had been wrapped and unwrapped and rewrapped so many times it had gone grey at the creases. He moved like a man who knew where his feet belonged on any surface. There was no wasted motion, no swagger, just efficiency that had been beaten into his skeleton over years of standing in front of other men who wanted to hit him and learning how not to be where their fists arrived. The second one was shorter, 5'10", but wider, thicker. His neck was broader than his jaw. His traps rose up from his shoulders like slabs of concrete that had been poured wrong and left to set, and nobody saw a reason to fix them because they worked fine the way they were. He had cauliflower ears. Both sides, the kind that do not come from one incident but from hundreds. From years of another man's skull grinding against yours while you both fought for position on the ground. He rolled his shoulders when he walked. The unconscious habit of a man who has spent a decade loosening the same muscles before wrapping his arms around another human being and dragging them to the floor. They had been told to come here by the mutual friend. They had been told there was someone worth meeting, someone who would change the way they thought about what they did. They had heard that before. They had heard it dozens of times. People were always telling them about someone special, someone different. It was never true. It was always a man who was good at one thing, and between the two of them they were good at two things, and the math never worked out for the person they had come to see. The taller one looked at Bruce Lee sitting on the floor. He looked at the plain black shirt and the bare feet, and the 135 pounds arranged cross-legged on the wood. He leaned toward his brother and said something. Low. Under his breath, they both laughed. Bruce Lee did not laugh. Bruce Lee did not smile. Bruce Lee looked at them the way a man looks at a clock when he knows exactly what time it is, but checks anyway out of habit. He stood up. The motion was strange. There was no push off the floor. No hand planted for leverage. No visible engagement of any muscle group that should have been necessary to take a human body from seated to standing. He simply was sitting, and then he was standing, as if someone had edited out the frames in between. The brothers stopped laughing, not because the standing up was threatening, because it was impossible, because they had both spent their entire lives inside bodies that obeyed physics in a specific way, and they had just watched a body that seemed to have a different arrangement with gravity. Bruce Lee looked at the taller one, then at the shorter one. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask their names. He did not bow or extend a hand or do any of the things that men do in gyms when they are being polite before they stop being polite. He said 5 words. Which one of you is first? Not a question, not a challenge, a logistical inquiry. Like a man at a deli counter asking who is next. Flat, practical, as if the outcome was already known and the only variable left was the sequence. The taller brother stepped forward. He did not warm up. He did not stretch. He did not bounce on his toes or shake out his hands or do any of the rituals that fighters do before they fight. He simply shifted his weight onto his back foot and brought his hands up into a high guard and became what he was, a boxer. His stance was orthodox, left foot forward, right hand by his jaw, chin tucked, elbows in. Every line of his body formed a structure that had been designed over 100 years by 1,000 men who had learned through blood which angles protect you and which ones get you killed. It was beautiful. It was technically perfect. It was the kind of stance that wins fights in rooms exactly like this one, against men who fight the way other men fight. Bruce Lee did not adopt a stance. He stood with his hands at his sides. His lead foot was forward, but only barely. His weight was distributed in a way that looked wrong. It looked like he was leaning slightly in a direction that didn't help him. It looked like he was off balance. It looked like the first hard push would send him sideways. It did not look like a fighting position. It looked like a man standing at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The taller brother looked at this arrangement and saw what every boxer sees when they look at a man with his hands down. An opportunity, an open target, a chin sitting unprotected on top of a neck that wasn't defended by anything except air and whatever the small man thought was going to save him. He threw a jab, a real one, not a rangefinder, not a feeler, a jab with his full 160 pounds of rotation behind it. Shoulder turning, hip driving, fist traveling in a straight line from his guard to where Bruce Lee's jaw had been 1/10 of a second earlier. Had been. The fist passed through the space where the jaw was supposed to be and kept going and found nothing, and the taller brother's arm extended into empty air, and for a fraction of a second he was exposed on his left side, with his weight committed forward and his center of gravity ahead of his feet. Bruce Lee had moved his head 1 inch to the right. 1 inch, not a slip, not a roll, not a weave, 1 inch, the exact width of the fist travelling past him. His feet had not moved, his hands had not moved, his eyes had not moved, only his head, 1 inch to the right, and then back to center. And by the time it was back to center, the punch was already behind him, and the taller brother was already resetting. The boxer reset. He was not shaken. He was a professional. He had missed before. Every boxer misses. The great ones miss less. But missing happens. He reset his feet, brought his guard back to his jaw, and he looked at Bruce Lee with a different kind of calculation now. The first calculation had been about size. This one was about speed. He was recalibrating, adjusting, figuring out the timing of the man in front of him, so the next punch would land where the head was going to be, not where it used to be. He threw a cross, straight right hand, faster than the jab, because now he was serious. The cross was followed immediately by a left hook, because he was not a man who threw single punches. He threw combinations, because combinations are how boxers break through guards and overwhelm defenses and create the half second of confusion that lets the finishing shot land clean. The cross missed, the hook missed, both by the same margin, 1 inch, the same inch, as if Bruce Lee had measured the exact tolerance required to make a fist miss without wasting a single millimeter of movement on anything more than what was necessary. The taller brother backed up, 2 steps. He reset. His breathing had changed, not because he was tired, because his body was telling him something his mind had not caught up to yet. His body was telling him that the man in front of him was not doing what men do in fights. Men in fights react. They see a punch, and they respond to it. They block, or they slip, or they counter, and all of it happens in the window of time between the punch being thrown and the punch arriving. Bruce Lee was not reacting to the punches. He was reacting to something before the punches, something in the taller brother's shoulders, something in his hips, something in the micro-movement of his rear foot, before his weight shifted. Bruce Lee was reading the letter before it was sent. He was answering the question before it was asked, and the taller brother's body understood this before his brain did. Which is why his breathing changed. He came in again, this time with everything. A jab to establish range, a second jab to confirm it, a cross to the body to change the eye line, a left hook to the head to catch the chin dropping, an overhand right to finish. 5 punches in under 2 seconds. Every single one thrown with the technical precision of a man who had been doing this since he was 14 years old and had never had a reason to doubt that his hands were enough. None of them landed, not one. Bruce Lee moved through the combination the way water moves through rocks. He was not avoiding the punches, he was occupying the spaces between them. Each movement was the smallest possible adjustment that still resulted in the fist finding air instead of flesh. His head, his torso, his chin. Each one moved independently, as if his body was not one thing but several things that had agreed to cooperate for the duration of this exchange. And then Bruce Lee moved forward. 1 step, a single step. His lead foot covered maybe 18 inches of floor, and as it landed, his lead hand came up, not a fist, an open palm. The fingers were relaxed, the wrist was straight. The hand traveled from his side to the taller brother's chest, in a motion so fast that the taller brother did not see it leave. He only felt it arrive, an open palm on his sternum. The pressure was not violent, it was not a strike, it was a placement. Bruce Lee placed his hand on the man's chest, the way you would place a stamp on an envelope, precisely, without excess force. The taller brother stumbled backward 3 steps, not from pain, not from impact, from surprise, from the sudden, disorienting realization that the hand had been there before he knew it was coming, that the man in front of him had been within striking distance of his heart for a full second and had chosen to touch him instead of hit him, that the open palm on his sternum was not an attack. It was a message. It was a sentence written in pressure and speed that said, "I was here, and you didn't know, and I chose not to hurt you, and you should think about what that means." The taller brother stood with his back almost against the wall. His tape-wrapped hands were still up, his guard was still intact. Everything about his stance was still technically correct, but his eyes had changed. Something behind them had shifted. The calculation was gone, the measurement was gone. What was left was something simpler and older and more honest. He looked at his brother looked back. Something passed between them, not a word, not a signal. Something that only exists between 2 people who have stood beside each other in enough rooms to communicate in a language that has no grammar and no vocabulary, just meaning. The taller brother lowered his hands. He stepped to the side. The shorter brother stepped forward. He did not adopt a boxing stance. He dropped low. His hands came forward, palms open, fingers spread. His base widened until his center of gravity was somewhere around his belt line. He rolled his neck once, a single rotation. The sound of his vertebrae adjusting was audible from 12 feet away. He was not a man who hit people. He was a man who grabbed people, who folded them, who took them off their feet and put them on the floor and kept them there until they accepted that the ground belonged to him. Bruce Lee watched him settle into position, and Bruce Lee changed. It was almost invisible. A quarter-inch adjustment of his rear foot, a slight rotation of his lead hip, a repositioning of his hands that moved them maybe 2 inches from where they had been. To the taller brother watching from the side, it looked like nothing, like a man fidgeting, like a minor shift in weight. But to the shorter brother, who had spent his entire life reading bodies for the clues that tell you where a man's balance lives and where it is vulnerable, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a door closing. Every angle he had been calculating, every entry point he had been measuring, every route from where he stood to where Bruce Lee's hips were, all of them changed in that quarter-inch adjustment. The geometry of the fight rearranged itself around a shift so small it shouldn't have mattered. But it did, the way a single degree of rudder changes where a ship arrives after 1,000 miles. The shorter brother didn't care. He had shot double-leg takedowns on men who knew they were coming and could not stop them. He had taken down men who were better athletes, stronger grapplers, more experienced wrestlers. He had taken down men who had trained their entire lives specifically to stop what he was about to do, and he had taken them down anyway. Because when 210 pounds of bone and muscle committed itself to a downward trajectory at full speed, technique mattered less than physics. He shot a double-leg takedown, both hands reaching for the hips, head to the side, driving forward and down with everything. He covered 6 feet of floor in under a second. His hands reached the space where Bruce Lee's hips had been. Bruce Lee was beside him, not behind him, not above him, beside him, to the left, at an angle that the shorter brother's momentum made it impossible to redirect toward. The wrestler's hands closed on empty air, and his driving legs carried him forward into the space where a man had been sitting 30 seconds ago, and was now simply not. And as the shorter brother's body traveled past, Bruce Lee did something that the taller brother, watching from the wall, would describe differently every time he told this story for the rest of his life. Bruce Lee placed 2 fingers on the back of the wrestler's neck. 2 fingers, the index and the middle. Placed, not driven, not struck. Placed the way a man places a coin on a counter. With precision, with control, with exactly enough downward pressure to suggest a direction without commanding one. The wrestler's face went to the floor. Not hard, not violently. His body simply followed the suggestion of those 2 fingers, the way a river follows the suggestion of gravity. His chest hit the wood, his palms slapped flat. He slid 2 feet across the surface and came to a stop with his cheek against the grain of the floor and his legs still extended behind him in the position of a man who had been moving very fast in a direction that no longer existed. The gym was silent, the fluorescent lights hummed. One of the heavy bags turned slowly on its chain, moved by nothing visible, as if the air in the room had rearranged itself around what had just happened, and the bag was responding to the displacement. The wrestler pushed himself up, fast, the way a man gets up when his pride arrives before his brain does. He was on his feet in under a second. His breathing was different now, faster, through his mouth. His nostrils flared on every exhale, and his shoulders had risen an inch from where they normally sat, and every tendon in his forearms was visible, because his fists were clenched even though he was not a man who used his fists. He was angry, not at Bruce Lee, at the floor, at the fact that the floor had been closer to his face than any floor had been in years, at the fact that 2 fingers had done what full-body takedowns and chokes and cranks had never done. He was angry at physics for betraying him. He was angry at his own legs for carrying him past a man who weighed 60 pounds less than he did, and somehow occupied a different country of speed. He shot again. Same entry, same double leg, but this time at a sharper angle. He had adjusted. He was aiming not for where Bruce Lee was, but for where Bruce Lee would have to go to avoid the first trajectory. It was smart. It was the kind of adjustment that separates a good wrestler from a great one. A great wrestler does not repeat the same mistake. A great wrestler closes the door that was open last time and forces you to find a new one. Bruce Lee did not find a new door. He did something that no one in the room had ever seen a human body do. He sprawled, but the word sprawl does not describe what happened. A sprawl in wrestling is a defensive movement. You kick your legs back and drop your hips to the mat to prevent the takedown. It is reactive. It is a response to an attack. What Bruce Lee did was not reactive, it was preemptive. His hips dropped before the wrestler's hands arrived. Not by much, by maybe a quarter of a second, but a quarter of a second at that speed is the difference between a man grabbing your hips and a man grabbing the air where your hips used to be. Bruce Lee's body seemed to fall through a hole in the floor. His hips vanished from the height where they had been and reappeared 6 inches lower and 4 inches to the right, and as they did, his right knee came up. The knee did not make contact. It rose beside the wrestler's head. Not into his temple, not into his jaw, beside his ear, close enough that the wrestler felt the fabric of Bruce Lee's pants brush against his skin, close enough that the displaced air touched his eardrum, close enough that every nerve in the wrestler's body understood what had almost happened and what had been chosen not to happen. The wrestler froze. He was on his knees. His hands were on the floor in front of him. His head was turned slightly to the left, toward the knee that was hovering beside his skull. He did not move. He did not try to grab the leg. He did not attempt to return to his base. He stayed on his knees with his palms flat on the wood, and he breathed. He understood what that knee meant. It meant that Bruce Lee could have ended the exchange at any point during the last 4 seconds, and had chosen not to. It meant that the 2 fingers on his neck were not a technique. They were a courtesy. It meant that the man standing above him had been in control of this encounter, from the moment the truck pulled into the parking lot, and everything that had happened since. Every jab thrown, every takedown attempted, every combination that missed by 1 inch, had been allowed to happen. Permitted, given room to exist so that the men throwing them could understand, through their own failure, what they were standing in front of. Bruce Lee lowered his knee. He stepped back. He extended his right hand. The wrestler looked at the hand. He looked at Bruce Lee's face. He reached up and took it. Bruce Lee pulled him to his feet with a grip that was stronger than it should have been. The wrestler outweighed him by 75 pounds, and Bruce Lee pulled him off the floor like a man helping a child out of a chair. It was casual. It was effortless. And that effortlessness was perhaps the most disturbing thing that had happened in the last 11 minutes, because it meant that Bruce Lee had been operating at a fraction of what he was capable of, and everyone in the room knew it now. Now, Bruce Lee looked at the wrestler. His expression had not changed since the beginning. It had not shifted during the exchanges. It had not hardened when the boxer threw 5 punches in 2 seconds. It had not tightened when the wrestler charged. It was the same expression a man wears when he is reading a book he has already read and knows how every chapter ends. He said 2 words, "Again." The wrestler shook his head. Slowly, left to right. 1 rotation. It was not a gesture of defeat. It was not submission. It was something rarer. It was the physical expression of a man whose curiosity had just become larger than his pride. He did not want to fight Bruce Lee again. He wanted to understand Bruce Lee. And those are 2 different desires that live in 2 different parts of a man, and the wrestler had just crossed from one into the other. Bruce Lee nodded once. He picked up a towel from the bench along the wall. A plain white towel. He tossed it to the taller brother, who caught it without thinking. He picked up a second towel and tossed it to the wrestler. Then, Bruce Lee did something that neither brother expected. He sat back down on the floor, same position, cross-legged, hands on knees, as if nothing had happened, as if the last 11 minutes had been a pause between 2 periods of sitting, and the sitting was the main activity, and everything else was interruption. The side door opened. The mutual friend walked in. He had been watching from the parking lot through the newspaper-covered window. He had peeled back a corner of the newsprint and pressed his face to the glass and watched the entire thing. And now he walked in with the expression of a man who had bet on a horse he knew was going to win and had just watched it win and was trying not to look too satisfied. He looked at the brothers. He looked at the towels in their hands. He looked at the sweat on their faces and the dry fabric of Bruce Lee's black shirt and the absence of any mark or redness on Bruce Lee's skin. He said to the brothers, "So, what do you think?" The taller brother was leaning against the wall. His tape-wrapped hands were hanging at his sides. His guard was down, not because he had lowered it, because it no longer seemed necessary, because the concept of guarding yourself in a room with Bruce Lee had revealed itself to be decorative, symbolic, like bringing an umbrella into a building that has no roof and pretending it will keep you dry. He said, "Who the hell is he?" The mutual friend looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee looked back at him with an expression that gave permission without giving instruction. The mutual friend said a name. He said it once, quietly. The way you say something that doesn't need volume because the weight of it is enough. The taller brother did not react immediately. The name entered his ears and traveled to the part of his brain that stored faces and reputations and magazine covers and television appearances, and it took 2 full seconds for the connection to complete. 2 seconds of silence in which the fluorescent lights hummed and the heavy bag turned on its chain, and the wrestler stood with a towel over his shoulder, staring at the man on the floor. Then the boxer sat down, on the bench, slowly, as if his legs had made a decision his brain had not approved. He sat down, and he put his tape-wrapped hands on his knees, and he looked at Bruce Lee the way a man looks at an equation he has been solving wrong for years and has just seen the correct answer, written on a wall. The wrestler did not sit down. He put his hands on his hips, and he tilted his head back, and he stared at the ceiling. He stayed that way for 6 seconds. When he looked back down, his eyes were different. Not softer, wider, like a man who has been living in a room he thought was the whole house and has just been shown the hallway. Bruce Lee said nothing during any of this. He sat on the floor and he waited for the recognition to finish, and for the silence after the recognition to finish, and for the men to arrive at whatever they were going to arrive at on the other side of that silence. The taller brother spoke first. "You could have hit me. Any of those times. You could have hit me." Bruce Lee looked at him. Yes. The boxer nodded slowly. He was not asking for confirmation. He was asking for something else. He was asking for the reason. "Why didn't you?" Bruce Lee considered the question. He took his time with it. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the question deserved the weight of a pause before it received an answer. "Because you would have learnt the wrong thing," he said. "If I hit you, you learn that I can hit you. That teaches you nothing about you. It only teaches you about me. I wanted you to learn about the spaces, the places your punches go when they don't land, the air you leave behind when your weight goes forward. That is where the lesson is, in the empty space, not in the contact." The boxer stared at him. Bruce Lee turned to the wrestler. "When you shot the double leg," he said, "what was your backup plan?" The wrestler frowned. "What do you mean? If the takedown failed, what was next?" The wrestler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He had no answer. Not because he was unintelligent, because the question had never been asked. In his world, the takedown did not fail. The takedown was the answer to every question the fight could ask. If a man was standing, you took him down. If he stuffed the first attempt, you chained into the second. If he sprawled, you switched to a single leg. But all of those options were versions of the same answer. They were dialects of the same language. And Bruce Lee was asking him what he would say if that entire language disappeared. "You are a specialist," Bruce Lee said. The word was not an insult. It was a diagnosis. He said it the way a doctor says a word that describes a condition accurately without judgment. You do one thing, and you do it better than almost anyone. But a specialist is a man with one door. When that door is open, he is unstoppable. When it is closed, he is standing in a hallway with no rooms. The wrestler listened. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were open, and that is the posture of a man who is being told something he does not want to hear, but cannot stop listening to. A complete fighter, Bruce Lee continued, is not a man who does one thing perfectly. He is a man who does many things adequately, and one thing perfectly, and knows when to use which. Your wrestling is extraordinary. Your instinct to close distance is correct. Your ability to control another body on the ground is something I have rarely seen. But you are blind above the waist and deaf to timing, and you have no answer for a man who can move laterally faster than you can redirect. He turned to the boxer. "Your hands are beautiful," he said. "Your jab is one of the best I have seen at this distance. Your combinations are structured correctly. Your rotation is efficient, but you are blind below the waist. You have no answer for low kicks, no answer for a man who changes levels, no answer for anything that exists outside the box you have built between your shoulders and your fists. Boxing is a magnificent art, but it is a house with no basement and no attic. It is all middle floor. The boxer and the wrestler looked at each other. They had spent their entire lives being told they were good. They had spent their careers proving it. They had 22 years of combined training between them, and they had never heard anyone describe their limitations with such precision and such absence of cruelty. Bruce Lee was not diminishing them. He was mapping them. He was drawing the borders of their territories and showing them for the first time that borders existed at all. The boxer asked a question that had been forming since the open palm touched his sternum. "Could you beat us both at the same time?" Bruce Lee looked at him for a long time. The silence lasted 5 seconds, 6. The heavy bag turned on its chain. The fluorescent light flickered once and recovered. "That is not the right question," Bruce Lee said. The boxer waited. "The right question is, could I make both of you stop wanting to fight in under 10 seconds? And the answer is yes, because I already did." The brothers looked at each other. The boxer looked at his hands. The wrestler looked at the floor where his face had been. They realized he was right. They had stopped wanting to fight him. Not at a specific moment, not after a specific technique. It had happened gradually, and then all at once, like a tide going out, and they hadn't noticed until he pointed at the dry sand and said, "Look." Then Bruce Lee did something that broke the pattern of every encounter both brothers had ever had with a man who was better than them. He asked them to teach him. He turned to the boxer and said, "That combination, the one you threw third, the body shot that set up the uppercut. Show me the rotation. I have never seen anyone load the right hand from that angle before." The boxer blinked. He looked at the mutual friend leaning against the wall. The mutual friend shrugged. He looked at Bruce Lee. "You want me to show you?" "Yes." The boxer unwrapped his right hand slowly, then rewrapped it, tighter. He stepped to the center of the floor and he showed Bruce Lee the combination. Slow first, then at half speed, then at full speed. And Bruce Lee watched with an attention so total that the boxer later said it felt like being photographed. Like every muscle fiber, every tendon, every angle of every joint was being recorded and filed and stored in a system that would never lose the image. Bruce Lee replicated the combination on his third attempt. Not approximately, exactly. The same rotation, the same hip load, the same angle on the right hand. The boxer watched himself in another man's body and felt something he could not name. It was not jealousy. It was not admiration. It was the feeling of watching someone speak your language with a better accent than you. Then Bruce Lee turned to the wrestler. He said, "The wrist control. In the clinch. When you grabbed for my hips the second time, your left hand rotated inward before your right hand committed. That rotation is something I have not seen before. Show me what happens after you secure that grip." The wrestler showed him, slowly, patiently, the way a man shows something precious to someone who has earned the right to see it. He showed the grip, the rotation, the way the wrist turns the opponent's center line and creates an angle for the hips to enter. He showed the chain from wrist control to body lock, to trip. Bruce Lee absorbed it, integrated it, asked 2 questions about the timing of the hip entry, practiced it once against the wrestler at quarter speed. The wrestler felt the technique done back to him with a precision that made his own version feel like a rough draft. This, the narrator would say, was who Bruce Lee was. Not a man who proved he was better, a man who proved that better did not exist. Only more complete, and he became more complete by learning from everyone who stood in front of him, including 2 brothers who had walked into a gym laughing and were now sitting on a wooden floor teaching the greatest fighter alive, the things they knew that he did not. They stayed for another hour. The conversation moved from technique to philosophy. Bruce Lee talked about water, not the famous speech, not the version the cameras would capture, the private version, the one he shared in empty gyms with men who had earned it through sweat. He said that water does not choose a shape before it enters a container. It does not decide to be a river before it finds a valley. It arrives and it becomes whatever the space requires. That is what a complete fighter does. He does not arrive with a plan. He arrives with a capacity for every plan, and the fight tells him which one to use. The brothers listened. They did not interrupt. They did not argue. Not because they were intimidated, because they were learning, and learning. Real learning requires a silence that most men are too proud to maintain. At some point, the light outside changed. The orange, smog-filtered afternoon had turned into the flat grey of a Los Angeles evening. The gym was darker now. The fluorescent light that had been flickering finally gave up and went out, and nobody moved to fix it, because the conversation was more important than the light. Bruce Lee stood up, the same impossible motion, seated to standing with no visible mechanism. He extended his hand to the taller brother, then to the shorter one. His handshake was firm but not performative. It lasted exactly long enough to say what a handshake says when it is honest. He picked up a small bag from beside the bench. He put on a pair of plain dark shoes. He walked toward the side door. At the threshold he turned back. He looked at both brothers one more time. His face was calm. His eyes were warm, not kind. Warm. There is a difference. Kind is what you offer to people who need comfort. Warm is what you offer to people who have earned respect. He said, "Your problem is not that you are specialists. Your problem is that you are specialists who believe specialization is enough. The moment you stop believing that, you will become very dangerous." Then he walked out. The cinder block was still holding the door open. He stepped over it. His footsteps crossed the gravel. A car door opened and closed, an engine started, and then the parking lot was quiet, and the gym was quiet, and the two brothers were standing in a room that smelled like sweat and old leather, and something else now. Something that had not been there when they arrived. Possibility. They stood in silence for a long time. The mutual friend eventually pushed off the wall and said he was going to get food. And did they want anything? And they said no. And he left through the same door. The brothers were alone. The taller one looked at his hands. The tape was dark with sweat. He began unwinding it. Slowly, the way you undo something you have done 1,000 times when you are thinking about something else entirely. The shorter one sat down on the bench. He put the towel over his face, and he breathed into it, and he stayed that way for a full minute. They walked to the truck. The parking lot light was on. A moth circled it in a pattern that would never resolve. They got in. The doors closed. Neither spoke for 12 minutes. The wrestler counted. Later, when he told this story, he always mentioned the 12 minutes, as if the silence was as important as anything that had happened inside the gym, as if the silence was the part of the story where the real learning happened. The wrestler broke first. He said, "He learned my wrist control in one try." The boxer did not respond for another 30 seconds. When he did, he said something that became the sentence both brothers carried for the rest of their lives, the sentence they repeated when people asked them about the best fighter they ever faced, the sentence that lived longer than the memory of any punch or takedown or open palm. He said, "He wasn't fighting us, he was reading us, and when he was done reading, he handed us back to ourselves with the pages in a different order." They drove the rest of the way in silence. The boxer changed his training within a month. He added kick defense. He began studying footwork from disciplines he had dismissed for years. He started training with a man who taught Filipino stick fighting, not because he wanted to learn stick fighting, but because the footwork was triangular and boxing footwork was linear, and Bruce Lee had shown him that linear was a limitation. He had been calling a style. He never became a martial artist, but he stopped being only a boxer. And the distinction cost him nothing and gave him everything. The wrestler started training with a speed coach, not to wrestle faster, not to shoot quicker takedowns, to understand timing, to feel the difference between reacting to what a man does and reading what a man is about to do. He said years later that the man in that gym had shown him that speed was not about muscles, speed was about decisions, and decisions were about seeing, and seeing was about being willing to look at the places you had been trained to ignore. Neither brother ever saw Bruce Lee again. They did not return to the gym in Inglewood. They did not write letters. They did not ask the mutual friend to arrange another meeting. Not because they didn't want to, because they understood, in the way that men understand things they cannot explain, that the lesson had been complete, that going back would be repetition, that Bruce Lee had given them everything he intended to give them in those 11 minutes and the hour that followed, and the rest was their responsibility. But both of them separately, in different cities, in different decades, when asked about the best fighter they ever faced, said the same thing. They didn't say his name, they didn't say Bruce Lee. They didn't describe the techniques or the speed or the open palm on the sternum or the 2 fingers on the back of the neck. They said 2 words, the substitute, because that is what he was. He was always the substitute, the replacement, the man who showed up when someone else cancelled, the man who walked into rooms where he was not expected and left them permanently altered, the man who was never the first choice and was always the last memory. He was the substitute, and he changed every room he walked into, even the ones that didn't know he was there, especially those